right? Great. So if we start to get a little bit of buffering, we may ask the participants to go off of camera. But until we have that problem, feel free to leave your camera on if you would like. My name is Warren Alford. I am located right outside of Tampa, Florida. I am a consultant and owner of ALS Cybersecurity. My background it comes from aviation and also DoD contracting as well. For my customers, I perform assessments, cloud audits, incident response testing, vulnerability assessments, penetration testing, both logical and physical, risk assessments. I also put together and test business continuity and disaster recovery plans for my clients, and I also do supplier evaluations as well. I am a APMG CISA accredited trainer, and I do teach CISA courses with Cybercraft, who is Dennis is the owner of. So if you're interested in going through the CISA, getting that certification, certainly reach out to Dennis. He can help you with that. I am a certified information systems auditor, certified ethical hacker, certified software quality engineer, Six Sigma black belt, certified quality manager, operational excellence, a certified quality auditor, and an ISO 27001 lead auditor. I added my LinkedIn profile. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn if you're on that platform. I do share a lot of information like recent cyber attacks, recent updates of some of the software that's out there that may have 0 days that have been discovered. So feel free to reach out. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about auditing the cloud, and we're going to approach this from the auditor's perspective. So we're going to talk a little bit about what things need to be in place, what things are recommended to be in place, and obviously we're going to talk about a little bit of the audit process as it applies to cloud auditing. Now, for those of you that were expecting maybe some command line stuff, we may do a presentation in the future about that. That's not going to be this one today, but I do have those skills, and we can certainly do a webinar in the future on that. When you are approaching auditing the cloud, there are some things that I think are very important from my experience. First of all, cloud itself obviously is a very in-demand thing. It's a self-service in many aspects. Because a client can sign up, they can actually start the cloud environment no matter what time of day or night. They can spin up virtual machines in that environment. And basically, once they subscribe to a cloud solution, they really don't have to have very much interaction with that cloud provider, and they can pretty much make it their own. Another plus is the broad access to the cloud. So you can access the network from anywhere, pretty much by any device that's out there. Another positive is resource pooling, and this works from the company standpoint because it does lessen the amount of money because it is a pooled service. So the amount of money that the company is going to pay for that cloud service will be less than it would be if they were doing maybe standing up another computer and running everything off of that computer itself. In that multi-tenant environment, it's also good for the provider because they are able to lease out this amount of space and pretty much have a guarantee of a certain amount of time per contract that that space is going to be used. It also has a rapid elasticity. So one big plus is the automatic scaling, the scale in and the scale out at any time. Again, in the middle of the night, a company can decide we need more bandwidth, or we need to expand the cloud, or we need to spool up a few more virtual machines, and they don't have to contact anyone. If they have already leased or purchased that amount of cloud, they can pretty much expand it. And usually the contracts include a provision for that up to and including a certain amount of gigabytes or terabytes or what have you. It's also a measured service, so the resource control and optimization can be leveraged in a metering capacity. As I said before, you can certainly expand or contract based on the company's needs. And the last one is utility mindset. Cloud can be seen as a monthly expense, just like electricity, gas. It can be planned for, it can be budgeted, and this is a good advantage for most companies who want to budget for the next year, or they're putting together their 5-year strategic plan. They would have a certain fixed cost that they would know ahead of time. And so that cost is obviously based on the need. There are several different actors when it comes to cloud computing, and these are important for the auditor to understand because these relationships can be very simple. They can also be very complex. Starting at the left top corner, we have the cloud consumer, and this is basically the person or organization that contracts to use the cloud. So they're the ones that will actually sign a contract with a cloud provider or a cloud broker, or cloud carrier, as we'll talk about in just a minute. But it's the organization that wants to use the cloud. And then we have the cloud provider, and that's the organization or entity responsible for making that service available to the cloud consumer. And this is going to be a pivotal role in the fact that most of the time the service level agreements are tied around that provider. And we'll talk a little bit more about the SLAs and how they compare with contract requirements as well. Then you have the cloud broker, and this is a company that really goes around to the providers, and they, in many cases, package the provider's bandwidth, so to speak, into different packages, and they sell those to the third party. So in this case, you can, as you can imagine, you'll probably have a very involved relationship, and there may be contracts and SLAs between the broker and the broker, provider, and the consumer. And last on this list as far as the cloud involvement is the cloud carrier. And this is the intermediary that provides connectivity and transport of cloud services from the provider to the consumer. So as you can see, you may have several contracts, you may have several different SLAs, and it's important for the auditor to fully understand what those are and what the nature of those relationships are. Because without that, it will not be an effective audit. And then obviously you have the cloud auditor, and that is the party, the consultant, the internal auditor, or what have you, that is responsible for evaluating the cloud. There, I guess, from a contract aspect, contracts are many times one size fits all. If you've audited in this space before, you'll find that many times contracts look the same. So if a company is contracting with AWS, they're probably going to have a similar contract based on their needs that another consumer would have. These contracts are used over and over, and there may be a certain degree of customization, but they're usually very high level, and they're not very descriptive when it gets down to the detail part of the relationship. For that, we usually look at the SLAs, service level agreements, and those are the ones that will have the performance. They will also have the expectation of responsibilities, accountabilities. Usually those roles are identified in the SLAs, and those are the ones that are a little more granular. And usually those are the ones that the auditor is going to really focus on when looking at effectiveness. So in one aspect, a service level agreement can be very general, but what you will probably find is that they're very specific as far as availability, uptime, bandwidth, even buffering and jitter, availability time. All of these are different SLAs that are usually put in place to make sure that the cloud consumer is getting what they pay for. So digging into these, another plus is that many times contracts will have qualitative requirements, yes, no, but the performance part of the SLA will have quantitative. And those are a lot easier to look at and better when you're looking at the overall effectiveness of the SLA. There are different deployment models, and we see many of these and different arrangements. In other words, one deployment model may not be the only one that the company has that you're auditing. It may be a combination of public cloud, private cloud, even community cloud. If you're looking at companies that do research, many times the community cloud will be used by several different organizations so they can share the information as they're doing research or as they're doing even development of certain things. You'll find that community cloud is part of that. Usually what we see is a hybrid cloud. It's a little piece of each one of these in different configurations based on different needs. And as you can imagine, each one of these comes with its own set of risks and challenges when it comes to cybersecurity. The public cloud is shared among multiple customers, and examples of that can be AWS, Dropbox, O365, Azure, Netflix even is in a public cloud environment where people can access it. And sometimes that's geo-fenced, where you can only access it from certain locations or a certain range of IP addresses or certain countries even. Then you have the private cloud, and this is modeled after the public cloud, but it's built, managed, and used internally by an enterprise. And this private cloud can include their intranet. So they may deploy an intranet, and on that intranet, they may have shareware, they may have SharePoint, they may have different apps. They may even deploy a thin client inside that environment so that their access to Microsoft applications is run off of the main computer, and it's basically an iteration of that or an access to that on the individual user's computer. As I mentioned, the hybrid cloud is just a mixture of those, and this is the most common that I see out in the wild as I'm doing assessments. Many of these are brand names that you're familiar with, but some of them go down into different aspects. Like AWS is obviously a very popular cloud, but they also have different pieces of their cloud, like outposts and different things like that. We talked about the community cloud and how it's usually applied. One last thing I'll mention is this is real popular with medical companies. So hospitals and things like that will have a community cloud setup. And these are set up where not only can the individual organizations access that cloud environment, but in some cases, customers or patients can access those environments in that particular community cloud. There are different infrastructures, platforms, and software services available too for cloud. So the first one is very common to be seen out in the wild, and that is infrastructure as a service. And this delivers a computer infrastructure, typically platform virtualization environment as a service. And obviously examples of that are AWS, Azure, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, etc. There's also a platform as a service, and this facilitates the deployment of applications while limiting or reducing the cost and complexity of buying and managing the underlying hardware software layers. This also allows for a lot of flexibility for organizations because they can buy platform as a service. They can actually put it in a development environment, and they can test different parts of their software with that environment, and basically have a thorough testing before they push it out or deploy it into the production environment. Then we have software as a service, and this delivers the software as a service over the internet, obviously. Applications may need to be written to meet certain specifications. Users utilize the vendor's IT staff and has a very limited or no technical staff available. So some examples of this is what we're using today, Zoom. But there's also Adobe, there's GoTo, Mongo Database, Oracle, Salesforce, Slack, and SurveyMonkey. So basically, this is the software itself, and you can buy a subscription to the specific software and get access to it. You do have a little bit of customization in the fact that you can change some of the settings, but all of these are offered as a boutique, so to speak, where you don't get access to the source code itself. You're limited by the developer of that SaaS. So you can only change certain parts of it. And then another cloud platform that we're seeing a lot of, obviously with the popularity of artificial intelligence, we're seeing artificial intelligence as a service. And this is a cloud-based emerging technology that is being pushed out and provided by a lot of companies, but really the major players in the market for right now, like Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and companies like that. But I suspect that it's going to be pushed out as things develop and AI gets better and better. More and more companies are going to use AI as a service. And this is really beneficial for companies that want to get into the AI space because they can actually purchase this AI cloud. They can move things into that environment, their own software in some cases. It can even be deployed in an infrastructure as a service in a development environment so that they can test their applications, or in some cases, write applications for their company that will be proprietary, that will use artificial intelligence, whether it's a tie-in to that or whether it uses certain pieces of artificial intelligence like machine learning or things like that. And it's also very attractive because it's a very low risk and a minimal upfront investment. So a lot of companies are really getting into this, and we're starting to see a lot more of these out in the wild. When we're talking about cloud computing from an auditor standpoint, it's important to know that these things differ greatly when it comes to responsibility, especially responsibility for the controls. So many times as an auditor, you may ask an interviewee about where they keep their data and information, and they say it's in the cloud. And as you start to dig down into the protection of that data and information, you may find that a lot of assumptions have been made by the auditee's organization as to who has the responsibility and, in some cases, the accountability for the actual control sets. So for instance, if we look at infrastructure as a service, we see that the consumer is responsible for the majority of the controls. Obviously, infrastructure is just, I like to think of it as a shell of the cloud. And what you put in there as an organization is going to be totally up to you, and how you secure that application is going to be up to you and your responsibility as an organization. The cloud provider will have some responsibilities, but usually they're very generic. In other words, the cloud provider will not want people accessing that particular environment without permissions. So they may have some kind of access control in place. Does that mean that it's going to meet the organization that is using that cloud? Is it going to meet their requirements? No. And in very few cases does it totally fulfill the control environment requirements that a company may have. Next, we look at platform as a service, and we see that this is almost a 50-50 responsibility. The consumer is responsible for a little bit less than the cloud provider. But again, as I said before, many times a consumer will subscribe to this type of service, and they will be under a false assumption that the cloud provider is going to put all of the controls in place and make sure they're effective, and that's not the case. Then we have software as a service. We can see that the consumer has even less responsibility, still some responsibility. And then as we go down into the artificial intelligence, we see even less. But you'll notice that there is not any circumstance in these examples that does not require the purchaser of the cloud environment, the consumer. It does not say that they have no responsibility with these environments. There's always a responsibility for the consumer. One thing to note as an auditor is cloud controls are shared responsibility always between the consumer and the provider. Again, the amount of responsibility is going to differ. That is usually defined in a contract, but it can also be defined in an SLA or maybe defined in a compliance matrix, so to speak, or a statement of applicability, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And those things, they really have to be clearly defined. Another thing to think about as an auditor is a cloud environment is just another computer, and it's in some data center somewhere in the world. Even if it is a virtual cloud, it's running off of a computer somewhere. And this can become an issue, especially when you get into situations where you're auditing a government contractor and their data may be prohibited from being stored anywhere else except in the US or a US territory. And so this can and often does present a real challenge when you're looking at the specific company. They may have ITAR, international trade restrictions. They may have compliance challenges with the FARs and DFARs, etc. And then obviously you may have heard of cybersecurity maturity model certification, which is CMMC, which is coming out as part of the DoD Defense Industrial Base. So these are things that you'll really need to look at, and you'll want to ask a lot of questions about that and tie that back. Sometimes you may hear an answer from an auditee that it's in the cloud. So, you know, it's smoke and mirrors, it's taken care of. Well, that's not exactly a good answer from an auditor's standpoint. You want to peel that onion and you want to go a little bit deeper and truly understand, do they even know where their data and information is being housed? And sometimes it's not very clear. It may require some digging around in the contract or in the statement of applicability to find out where that information is. One other consideration is really a big one, and that's standards and recommendations. So there are a lot of standards out there. There are a lot of guidance documents out there. And probably one of the top 10 questions that I get from my clients, especially if they're new to cloud computing, is where do I start? Is there a place that I can get an exhaustive list of controls that I need to put around my cloud environment? And so some of these standards that I have here will actually help with that. And some go into great detail, not only from an information systems management system or an ISMS perspective, but in different aspects of the ISMS, whether it is in a data center down the hall, or a data center down the street, or a data center somewhere in the world. These standards will certainly help with that. ISO IEC 27001 is a real good starting place. They do have in the annex a laundry list of controls, and ISO IEC 27002 is a good expansion of those controls. In other words, 27002 provides more information about those controls that are in that annex. So if you're wondering, how does this single sentence in this control, how can I implement it? What will be acceptable? Or what are some things to think about? That's where 27002 comes into play. And then there is the privacy requirements in ISO IEC 27701. That is a good information as well. Now, this is good for basic cybersecurity, not specific to cloud environments, but certainly can be put around cloud environments. If you're looking for specific cloud guidance, there are some guidance documents. ISO IEC 27017 and 27018. These are good documents, and they're more specific to the cloud environment than the 27000 series is. There are also offerings by CIS. They have a controls cloud comparison guide that is real good. You can actually go through that and compare controls between different standards. And this is a real good way to start looking at what controls the company may need. And it's a real good way for you as an auditor to be able to find some commonalities. It's a real good crosswalk between the different standards that you can use as an auditor. So if they say, well, we're compliant with a certain requirement, and you're auditing to another requirement, it's a real good crosswalk between those two. And then NIST has some good documents out there. 853 or special publication 853, special publication 800-171, which forms the basis of the new Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification, the CMMC certification that's coming out, is a good standard to look at, as well as the NIST Cloud Computing Standards Roadmap, which is a real good one for those that are just starting out and they're just starting the conversation as an organization. So these are good documents that you can refer your clients to as well. The last two I save here, these are published by ISACA, which is the organization for the CISA, Certified Information Systems Auditor, and they have full, complete audit programs. And these are really good if you're auditing Amazon Web Services or if you're auditing Google Cloud. These are good audit programs that are right out of the box, and you can use these. These are, of course, compliant with the ITAF, and you can take them, you can customize them for your specific client as well. And then at the bottom, we have each one of these organizations has a different type of cloud implementation guidance as well as assessment or auditing guidance. We have FedRAMP SANS, which is a fantastic organization. They have a lot of free information, free materials, but not only that, but they have free policies and procedures as well that you can download and customize. So if you've audited an organization and they do not have a certain policy, you can certainly refer them to this and have them take a look and see if it would be something that would fit their needs. And then they can download it, they can customize it for their specific business. So a very good resource. And then obviously Cisco, Tenable, Google, Palo Alto, AWS, they all have their own specific standards or assessment guides in some aspect to help you with that. So when we're starting to look at the cloud environment, and this starts with the preparation, and this kind of overlaps with the field work as we're going through it. You want to take a look at governance. And governance is sometimes a very weak area because there may be some misinformation in the organization. The executives may actually think that, well, we bought the cloud, so we're protected. All those controls are in place. I know they are. And, you may be the bearer of bad news in some aspects after you finish your audit of that. But there should be a cloud computing policy. This is very important. Again, if you have policies in place, that is basically executive leadership's desire to do something, and in the absence of that, it's probably not going to be done. Then you're going to have objectives and you're going to have key performance indicators. And again, looking for quantitative KPIs, those are going to be better utilized as for the organization, but also for the auditor in determining the effectiveness of the KPI. You're also going to look for a risk assessment and mitigation or remediation of certain things. And sometimes you may find this in the form of a statement of applicability, or it may just be their organizational risk assessment. But you want to make sure that the risk assessment is in enough detail that it's not so high level that it's not effective in assessing the overall risk of the IT or the cybersecurity area, the cyber space. You want to look at training and resource availability. You want to look at management review to see is the executive leadership actually looking at the ISMS or the cloud environment. You also want to look at the legal regulations, statutory requirements, and things like that. GDPR, as you know, for Europe is a very big deal, and sometimes organizations They know about it, they have it in place, but they only have it in place in certain parts of their system, and they may actually be violating that. HIPAA, DCI, DSS. Also, you want to look at right to audit. So does the organization have a right to audit their cloud provider? This is very important because they are not going to be able to have an assurance that the cloud provider is providing exactly what they're asking for by the SLAs in the contract if they don't have that right. Also, incident and breach reporting requirements. Make sure that those things are covered, but also make sure that those things are effective. And we'll talk a little bit more here in a moment about that. Look at the cloud consumer and provider contracts, as well as the carrier contract. As I said before, these can be very convoluted arrangements. Sometimes there can be a piece of this organization that's doing this specific thing, and then another piece does this, and another piece does this, and they're all under the same umbrella. However, they're not called out, or those roles, responsibilities, and accountabilities are not clear, and they have to be clearly defined, and there should be KPIs around that as well. In the cloud environment, the architecture is a very big piece of your preparation as well as field work. Again, there should be a risk assessment. That's going to be a living document. And I like to say that assessment is not analysis. So you want to make sure that there is an analysis part of the risk assessment. And that's a little deeper dive than just saying we have a risk and we're going to accept that risk. Acceptance of risk should only be after an intelligent conversation and consideration of what the adverse effects will be if that comes to pass. Also, the compliance matrix, or in some cases, you will have a statement of applicability, which are called out in ISO standards. Look at the cloud topology and the scope that they have around their management system. Sometimes you can take a quick look at their topology and you can see that whatever they're scoped for is not correct, just simply by looking at that picture and seeing where certain things go into certain areas or maybe go outside the boundaries of the organization. Separation of multi-tenants is important, and that needs to be looked at very close. Is there any way that there could be bleed over from the organization's neighbor in that cloud environment to them, or vice versa? Considering a lot of companies are now using to a managed service provider, or MSP, it's important to look at that and also look again at the contract and the SLAs around that. There should be a full inventory of connected devices. Now, this is going to include bring your own device, the Internet of Things, and the Internet of Trusted Things as well. And many times organization will, they will inventory everything that belongs to them, but they don't have an inventory of BYOD, and they do allow employees or customers to connect with their environment and access things using their own device. And this is important to take a look at. It's a very high risk area. Application program interfaces, so things that communicate with the environment, certain protocols and security requirements around those. The configurations and misconfigurations. Misconfigurations is probably the number one finding overall that I have. I guess summarily, most software packages are secure, but it's where the software begins to communicate with other parts of the network. That's usually where we find that there is an issue with that misconfiguration. Continuity and recovery strategy, again, is going to be very important. Should be a SLA around that if a customer is using the cloud environment backup solution that may be already in place. And remember that your recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives and things like that should be clearly defined for that cloud provider, as well as in the business continuity document for the organization. Artificial intelligence is again it's beginning to be more and more of a part when it comes to cloud environments. When you're looking at large language models, the deployment of AI, the neural networks and things like that. And this is a very complex issue beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. But I do plan to do a webinar on AI and how it affects auditing right now and how I think it will affect auditing in the future. When talking about artificial intelligence, there should also be a risk analysis. There should be some kind of compliance matrix or statement of applicability around what those requirements are and how they're being met and what those specific controls are. Looking at security, privacy, and data leakage, involuntary and voluntary. So many times organizations are using artificial intelligence like ChatGPT to generate proposals. And this may be a problem because they are feeding proprietary information into a system and they're basically giving information away. And in some cases, this may be a violation of federal law if it's a government contractor. If the contract is awarded, the proposals sometimes become part of CUI, and that has to be protected. And it becomes part of that retroactively to contract award. So that can be a huge impact. The automation management, monitoring, auditing, chatbots, and autonomous automation is a big consideration. Continuity and recovery strategy. We talked about AI as a service, network connectivity, uptime, downtime, things like that. Inaccurate information, which these systems are great, but they're not 100% foolproof. They still provide inaccurate information as a result, as well as hallucination. So, and then also legal implications when it comes to detrimental reliance. So relying on the information that the organization is providing through artificial intelligence may cause a legal injury, financially or otherwise, that the customer may decide to come after the organization for. This whole thing about controls is really around data. That's really the important part. And it's important not to lose sight that data is the reason for all of this. So you can be compliant, you can be conformant, but you may not be secured. And this is very important to look at from an auditor standpoint, to understand that you have to kind of change your focus. Not only are the boxes checked, but is the data being effectively protected? Obviously, CIA triad is important, and that also includes authenticity and non-repudiation as well. Data classification and locations is one thing that I see quite often. Data is not classified. Now, I'm not speaking of government classification. I'm talking about if you can't classify your information that your organization has, then you really don't know how to adequately protect it. And this can be anything from proprietary to sensitive information. Again, outside of the federal government's classification, this information and data inside your organization should be classified to understand how it needs to be protected. The company should also, or the organization should also know where that data and information is, where it goes, and how to protect it at rest, in use, or in motion. Should be a risk analysis associated with that. The data should have an owner and a custodian, so to speak. And then there should be clear responsibilities around that data. Should be documented user access authorizations as well as terminations. There should be data controls in place, obviously, and there should be controls around backup and restoration. That restoration should be tested as part of the business continuity plan. And then data deletion and disposal. So not only deleting the data from the environment, but what happens when you as an organization don't need that cloud environment anymore and it reverts back to the cloud provider. Well, what's going to happen with all of that data and information of yours that is in that cloud environment? So making sure that that's clearly defined is important. And then personnel. So looking at not only the consumer, but the provider. There should be job descriptions in place. There should be non-disclosure agreements and acceptable use agreements in place. There should be cloud-specific knowledge, skills, and abilities clearly defined, as well as job-specific training and capabilities and competence. There should be initial and refresher awareness training that is conducted at regular intervals. There should be competence evaluations that take place as well. Many times a company will give training, but they really never test to see if that training was in fact effective. And without actually evaluating that, the company is just saying, well, we've provided training, but we really don't know if those people truly understood and their behavior has been modified. And that's really the definition of training itself. And then there's always increased complexity, which strains your IT staff. And that can be true for any organization, any position, any department. With more and more complexity comes more and more strain. And this comes from a Gartner 2025 paper. 99% of cloud security failures will be due to some level of human error. So something to consider. Vendors should be considered, managed service providers, supply chain compromise. All of these things would greatly affect the organization. Again, looking at service level agreements, monitoring and measuring and things like that, as well as service improvement plans or corrective actions that are given to the organization. Business continuity, disaster recovery, as we said before, is a very big part of this, but having a document is not enough. It has to be tested. Otherwise, the organization really does not truly understand what the capabilities are, nor does the organization know that they have an effective plan of action. They don't want to find out that it's not effective when a real emergency or situation happens. So it really needs to be tested, and there needs to be some kind of lessons learned around that test to make sure that the company is constantly improving on their capabilities. Another consideration is access to the plan. So this is very important for the organization to determine who needs to know and who can have access to it, because it's going to be their game plan in many cases for an incident response. You really don't want that information being accessible by everybody for obvious reasons outside the organization, but also for internal, when you're looking at your own employees or members of the organization when it comes to insider threat. Roles and responsibilities, as well as the invocation of the plan, is very important. Who can invocate it? Who can actually start the incident response or the BCP or what have you, disaster recovery plan? Who can do it, and how is it done? How is it actually declared? Many times it's a very important missing part. And then virtualization is something that, again, most cloud environments are going to have virtualization around them, whether it's bare metal or hosted or containerized. The hypervisor and the guest configuration is probably the biggest misconfiguration that I see with my clients. There should also be an inventory of devices, baselines, and capacity management, as well as knowledge, skills, and abilities around how to administer that virtualization. Bear in mind that your operating system snapshots and things like that may contain passwords or sensitive data that's captured during that actual snapshot. Obviously, rootkits and things like that are a big risk, as well as shadow IT. And this is very common. Some staff will have access to be able to download and install certain software, and this is a big increased risk. And then obviously the last thing is a false sense of security that virtualization is going to change everything, but it doesn't really change the threat plan. So some closing thoughts. Cloud computing, is there a policy? Are there objectives and KPIs? Where is the cloud hosted? How does the cloud impact the overall management system, especially if you have several different combined systems and things like that? Cloud computing risk analysis and compliance matrix, also an SOA. Taking a look at the contracts, the SLAs, audits, taking a look at the past audits, taking a look at business continuity and all of those plans. Are they adequate? Are they tested? Are they effective? And what cloud computing controls are in place at the time? Which ones need to be in place? And the only way to tell if those controls are in fact effective is by testing those controls. So, do we have any questions? I know that's a lot of information real fast, only 1 hour to cover a very expansive and complex topic. But Dennis, do we have any questions?
Thanks so much, Warren. Are there any questions from anybody? I haven't seen any in the chat, but this is the time if you had some questions. I know we had some questions during sign up about AI and some other factors. If you have those questions, go ahead and take your time to ask them now.
Absolutely.
And I'll just ask Dawn, thanks for the emoji. If you don't have any questions, just give us a little emoji, a thumbs up or something.
And you know what? I'm so sorry. Yes, so I do have a question. And thank you. Very, very, very thorough presentation. I want to go back to the slide where it listed all of the standards and recommendations. And there were several that were listed to include the two from ISACA. Are there, and I know you mentioned at various times, each of them would be needed. Is there like one or two that we need to kind of keep at our disposal? It needs to be our Bible for auditing?
Well, as far as the criteria that you're auditing against, it's going to be important to have that. In other words, if you're doing an audit of ISO IEC 27001, obviously you'll need a copy of that. You'll also need a copy of 27002 as well. If there are privacy elements, 27701 would be applicable. So those are things to have. It's going to be specific to the client that you're auditing. Now, if you want general information, cloud information, ISO IEC 27017 and 27018 are good for that as well. So it's really going to depend on what the scope of the audit that you're performing is. As you're collecting information and reviewing that information and finding out, is a company certified? Are you doing a certification audit? Are you doing a gap analysis or what have you? That is pretty much going to require whatever document as far as the criteria. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does.
Okay.
Okay. So that's just, yeah, information that we need to do from the discovery conversation. Thank you.
That's correct. Yeah. Also, I mentioned artificial intelligence. I don't know if everyone is aware, but there is a standard on artificial intelligence, ISO IEC 42001. And as a matter of fact, companies can get certified to this. ANAB offers an accreditation to this right now. So for certification bodies that are interested in being able to give certificates to 42001, I did put a link in the presentation here, and you can click on that link, get more information. And if you're a certification body, you can fill out the application, and it's going to be a really big area for certifications. So, any other questions? And I don't have the comments available here, Dennis. So if you see something I'm not covering, I've got a lot of territory covered on my screen right now. So
No problem. Yeah, absolutely. One question we did have in the sign up was, do you foresee 27,017 and 18 to move or shift from guidance documents or to normative or requirement documents so that you can auditors could issue accredited certificates rather than unaccredited certificates?
I think so. I think it's all going to depend on people's comments and feedback and contacting ISO and asking for that. Those are good documents as guidance, but I know that ANAB is also looking at being able to use those as certification documents to become certified to 27,017 and 18. So there is a possibility. I do believe it's going to happen. And who knows, maybe one day ISO will take that and say, okay, it's been good guidance. Now we're going to use it as normative certification documents. Good question, though. Very good.
Great. That one came from Brenda. Well, thank you so much. I don't think we have, are there any more comments or questions?
No? Okay.
All right. Well, Warren, thank you so much for the fantastic presentation, for everybody for joining.
One last thing, Dennis. You will receive a CPE. So, Dennis, you have the certificate, and if you want to email those out, all you have to do is just put your name in there, and you get one continuing education credit for attending today.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll be sending those out here. So thank you very much again for joining. I'm going to stop the recording.